The telegram arrived at Clara Zimmerman's ranch 3 days before noon on that Tuesday in July 1882, informing her that the Denver First National Bank was calling in her husband's loan effective immediately. And she stood on her porch, reading those cold, impersonal words while the morning sun beat down on the dry Colorado earth of La Veta with the kind of merciless intensity that made even the lizards seek shelter. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 8 months now, thrown from a spooked horse during a thunderstorm, leaving her alone at 24 years old with 300 acres of struggling cattle ranch and a mortgage she had been paying faithfully every single month since his death. Yet somehow the bank claimed she had defaulted, and they were coming to take everything she had left in this world. Clara's hands trembled as she reread the telegram, her dark brown hair falling loose from its pins as she shook her head in disbelief, because she had the receipts for every payment locked in Thomas's old desk, proof that she owed nothing beyond the regular monthly sum she had just paid 2 weeks ago. The ranch house behind her was small but sturdy, built by Thomas's father 30 years prior, when La Veta was nothing more than a handful of buildings clustered at the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And Clara had scrubbed every inch of those wooden floors until they gleamed, had patched every hole in the roof, had worked her fingers raw trying to keep this place running, because it was all she had left of the man she had married at 19. She walked back inside, her worn boots echoing on those clean floors, and pulled out the metal box where Thomas had kept all their important papers, rifling through until she found the payment receipts, each one stamped and signed by the bank clerk in town. Her heart hammered in her chest as she counted them again, making absolutely certain she had not missed anything, but the numbers were clear as mountain water and just as pure. Clara knew she needed to get to town immediately and straighten this out with the bank manager before things got out of hand, so she hitched up her mare Daisy to the small wagon and made the 6-mile journey down the dusty road into La Veta proper, clutching that metal box against her chest like it contained her very soul. The town was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning, with ranch hands lounging outside the saloon and townswomen carrying baskets to the general store, and Clara felt their eyes on her as she drove past, knowing that everyone in La Veta knew her situation, knew she was a widow trying to hold onto her land in a world that seemed determined to take it from her. She pulled the wagon to a stop outside the Denver First National Bank branch, a relatively new brick building that stood out among the wooden storefronts like a sore thumb, and she climbed down with her box of receipts held tight. The interior of the bank was dim and cool, a relief from the scorching July heat, and Clara approached the clerk's window with her chin held high despite the fear churning in her stomach. The young clerk, a nervous man named Peter who had always been kind to her in the past, would not meet her eyes as she explained why she was there, and he stammered something about needing to speak with Mr. Nathaniel Whitmore, the bank manager who had arrived from Denver just 3 months ago. Clara waited on a hard wooden bench for 20 minutes before being ushered into Whitmore's office, a room that smelled of cigar smoke and expensive cologne, and the man behind the desk looked at her with eyes as cold as January frost. Nathaniel Whitmore was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed absurd in a frontier town like La Veta, and he barely glanced at Clara's receipts when she spread them across his desk with hands that shook despite her best efforts to remain calm. He explained in a voice devoid of sympathy that there had been an error in the original loan documents, that Thomas had actually taken out a larger sum than the papers showed, and that Clara's payments had not been sufficient to cover even the interest on the true amount owed. Clara's voice rose as she argued that this made no sense, that Thomas had been meticulous with their finances, that she had proof right here of every single payment made on time, But Whitmore simply shook his head and informed her that the bank's records superseded her receipts, and that the property would be seized at noon today to satisfy the debt. The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet as she understood what was happening, that this man was simply stealing her land through falsified documents, and there was nothing she could do about it because the law would always side with the bank over a widow. She pleaded with him, begged him to reconsider, offered to take out a new loan or arrange a payment plan. But Whitmore's expression never changed from that cold, calculated indifference, and he told her that the matter was settled and she should remove her personal belongings from the property before noon. Clara gathered up her receipts with numb fingers, stuffing them back into the metal box, and she walked out of that bank feeling like her legs might give out at any moment, because everything Thomas had worked for, everything his father had built, was about to be ripped away based on lies. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the bank, blinking in the bright sunlight, trying to figure out what to do next, and that was when she noticed the man watching her from across the street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical clothing of a working cowboy with a worn hat pulled low over his face, and something about the way he was looking at her made Clara think he had witnessed her distress and felt something akin to sympathy. She was about to turn away when he crossed the dusty street toward her, moving with the easy grace of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle. And as he came closer, Clara could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 27 or 28, with dark hair and striking blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Madam, I apologize for the intrusion, but I could not help noticing you seemed upset," he said, his voice deep and gentle, and he removed his hat respectfully as he spoke. "My name is Isaac Harper, and I have been working at the Double R Ranch just north of here for the past few months. I know it is not my place, but if there is any way I might be of assistance, I would be honored to help." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes at this unexpected kindness from a stranger, and she found herself explaining the entire situation right there on the sidewalk, words tumbling out in a desperate rush as she told this man Isaac about the telegram and the bank manager and the seizure happening at noon. Isaac's expression grew darker as she spoke, his jaw clenching with obvious anger, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "Mrs. Zimmerman, what that banker is doing is not just wrong, it is criminal," Isaac said firmly. "I have seen men like Whitmore before, using their position to steal from folks who cannot fight back. But there are ways to fight, if you are willing to try. I have a friend in Alamosa who is a land attorney, one of the few honest ones in Colorado, and if we can get to him before noon, he might be able to help us stop this." Clara looked at this stranger who was offering to help her when he had absolutely no reason to do so, and she felt something shift in her chest, a tiny spark of hope in the darkness that had been consuming her. Alamosa was 30 miles north, and it was already past 9 in the morning, which meant they would have to ride hard and fast to make it there and back before noon. But what choice did she have? She nodded, and Isaac immediately went into action, telling her to get her wagon and meet him at the livery stable where he would procure faster horses for the journey. Within 15 minutes, they were riding north out of La Veta on 2 strong horses borrowed from the livery owner, a grizzled old man who knew Clara's family and was more than willing to help when Isaac explained the situation. Clara had never ridden this hard in her life, the landscape blurring past as they galloped along the dirt road that wound through the valley, and she kept glancing at Isaac riding beside her, wondering what would possess a man to risk so much for someone he had just met. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, marking the passage of precious time, and Clara prayed silently that they would make it to Alamosa before her noon deadline arrived. They reached the town just before 10:30, their horses lathered with sweat, and Isaac led them directly to a small office on the main street where a sign proclaimed, "James Thornton, attorney at law." The attorney was a middle-aged man with silver hair and kind eyes, and he listened intently as Clara once again explained her situation, spreading her receipts across his desk while Isaac added details about Whitmore's behavior. Thornton examined the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim, and finally he looked up at Clara with determination written across his face. "Mrs. Zimmerman, this is clearly a case of fraud, but proving it in time to stop the seizure will be extremely difficult," Thornton said. "However, there is one thing we can try. If we can get to the county courthouse and file an emergency injunction based on your payment receipts, it might buy us enough time to investigate the bank's claims. The problem is that the courthouse is back in La Veta, and we would need to get there before noon to file the paperwork." Clara felt her heart sink, because they had just ridden 30 miles north and now needed to race 30 miles back south with only 90 minutes to spare. But Isaac was already standing, pulling out his pocket watch and calculating distances. He turned to Thornton with an urgent expression and asked how long it would take to prepare the necessary legal documents, and the attorney replied that he could have them ready in 15 minutes if they were willing to wait. Those 15 minutes felt like hours to Clara as she paced the small office, watching the second hand on the wall clock tick away her future. But true to his word, Thornton had the papers ready and pressed them into her hands with instructions on exactly what to say to the county clerk. They mounted fresh horses that Isaac somehow procured from a livery stable, and Clara did not even want to know what he had promised to pay for them. And then they were riding again, even harder than before, racing against the sun that seemed determined to reach its zenith before they could reach La Veta. Isaac kept pace beside her, occasionally calling out encouragement, and Clara found herself drawing strength from his presence, from the absolute certainty in his voice that they would make it in time. The landscape flew past in a blur of brown earth and scattered sage, the mountains looming to the west like silent witnesses to their desperate race, and Clara leaned low over her horse's neck, urging the animal to give everything it had. They thundered back into La Veta with the town clock showing 11:45, and Isaac led them straight to the courthouse, a small adobe building near the center of town. Clara practically fell off her horse in her haste, her legs shaking from the hard ride, and she ran up the steps with Isaac right behind her, bursting through the doors with the legal documents clutched in her sweaty hand. The county clerk, a woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had known Clara since childhood, looked up in surprise as Clara gasped out her request for an emergency injunction, and the older woman immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Henderson worked with practiced efficiency, stamping and filing the documents while explaining that the injunction would temporarily prevent the bank from seizing the property until a judge could review the case, and she had just finished the final signature when the clock struck noon. Clara collapsed into a chair, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and relief, while Isaac stood beside her with his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and she reached up without thinking to cover his hand with her own, grateful beyond words for what this stranger had done for her. But their relief was short-lived, because within 10 minutes Nathaniel Whitmore stormed into the courthouse with 2 hired men behind him, clearly intending to take possession of Clara's property by force if necessary. His face turned an alarming shade of red when Mrs. Henderson calmly informed him of the injunction, and he began shouting about how this was an outrage, how the bank's interests would not be thwarted by legal technicalities, how he would have Clara arrested for filing false documents. Isaac stepped forward then, positioning himself between Whitmore and Clara, and his voice was low and dangerous as he told the banker to watch his tone when speaking about Mrs. Zimmerman. The tension in that small courthouse was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Clara feared violence might erupt at any moment. But Mrs. Henderson called for the sheriff, and when the lawman arrived he sided with the injunction, ordering Whitmore to leave the courthouse and await the judge's decision. Whitmore left with threats hanging in the air, promising that this was not over, that he would see Clara homeless before the week was done. And Clara felt her brief moment of hope crumbling, because she knew that powerful men like Whitmore usually found ways to get what they wanted regardless of the law. After Whitmore left, Isaac helped Clara to her feet and suggested they go somewhere quiet to talk about their next steps, and she found herself agreeing, following him to a small restaurant on the edge of town where they could sit and catch their breath. The owner brought them water and coffee, and Clara drank deeply, realizing she had not had anything since breakfast early that morning. Isaac sat across from her, his blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with their morning's adventure. And she found herself noticing details about him she had been too panicked to see before: the strong line of his jaw, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Thank you," Clara said softly, her voice rough with emotion. "I do not know how I can ever repay you for what you did today. You did not have to help me, but you did, and you saved everything I have left in this world." Isaac reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture both comforting and strangely intimate, and Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his touch. "Mrs. Zimmerman, you do not owe me anything," he said gently. "I did what any decent person would do when they see an injustice being committed. But I have to be honest with you, this fight is far from over. Whitmore is not going to give up just because of a temporary injunction. We need to prove that he falsified those bank records, and that is going to take time and resources." Clara nodded, understanding the truth in his words, and she told him about the receipts she had, about how Thomas had always kept meticulous records, about how there might be other documents at the ranch that could help prove her case. Isaac suggested they ride out to her property immediately and search for anything that might be useful, and Clara agreed, even though her body ached from the hard riding and her mind felt foggy with exhaustion. They paid for their meal and retrieved their horses, and this time the ride to her ranch was slower, giving Clara time to really talk with Isaac and learn more about the man who had become her unexpected champion. Isaac told her he was originally from Texas, that he had been working as a cowboy since he was 15 years old, drifting from ranch to ranch, and never really settling anywhere until he arrived in La Veta a few months ago. There was something in the way he spoke about his past that suggested pain, old wounds that had not quite healed, and Clara found herself wanting to know more about what had shaped this kind, brave man. He asked her about Thomas, and she talked about her late husband with genuine affection, explaining how they had met at a church social, how he had courted her with shy persistence, how they had planned to fill the ranch house with children and grow old together watching the mountains change with the seasons. By the time they reached her ranch, the afternoon sun was slanting long shadows across the yard, and Clara felt a pang of relief at seeing her home still standing, still hers for at least another day. They went inside together, and Clara was suddenly aware of how intimate it felt to have Isaac in her private space, standing in the kitchen where Thomas had kissed her goodbye on that last morning before his fatal ride. She pushed those thoughts aside and led Isaac to Thomas's study, a small room lined with shelves holding account books and correspondence, and they began systematically searching through every document. Hours passed as they worked, the afternoon light fading into evening, and Clara lit lamps so they could continue reading through Thomas's papers. Isaac proved to have a sharp mind for numbers and legal language, pointing out discrepancies and asking questions that helped Clara see patterns she had missed before. They discovered that the original loan document in Thomas's files showed a completely different amount than what Whitmore had claimed. And even better, Thomas's copy had been notarized by a justice of the peace who still lived in Alamosa. Clara felt hope surge again, because this was concrete proof of the fraud, evidence that could not be easily dismissed. Isaac suggested they ride back to Alamosa first thing in the morning to get a sworn statement from the notary public, and he asked if he could bed down in the barn for the night so they could get an early start. Clara agreed, but then felt her conscience prick her, because it seemed wrong to make him sleep in the barn after everything he had done, and she offered him the small guest room instead. Isaac hesitated, clearly concerned about propriety, but Clara insisted, pointing out that she was a widow managing her own ranch and people in La Veta would gossip no matter what she did, so he might as well be comfortable. They had a simple dinner of bread and cheese and preserved vegetables from Clara's cellar. And as they ate, Clara found herself studying Isaac in the lamplight and wondering what twist of fate had brought him to La Veta at exactly the moment she needed him most. She had not thought about men in a romantic way since Thomas died, had assumed that part of her life was over at 24, but something about Isaac made her feel alive in a way she had forgotten was possible. The way he listened when she spoke, really listened like her words mattered, the way he moved through her home with respectful care, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. All of it was awakening feelings Clara thought had been buried with Thomas. After dinner, Isaac stepped outside to check on the horses while Clara cleaned up the kitchen, and she caught herself watching him through the window, admiring the confident way he moved in the darkness. When he came back inside, stamping dust from his boots, their eyes met across the small kitchen and something electric passed between them, an acknowledgement of attraction that neither of them was quite ready to speak aloud. Clara felt her cheeks flush and turned away, busying herself with putting away the dishes, and Isaac cleared his throat and said he would turn in for the night since they needed to be up before dawn. Clara lay awake in her bed that night, listening to the familiar creaks of the house and the unfamiliar knowledge that Isaac was sleeping just down the hall, and she found herself thinking not about the legal battle ahead, but about the way his hand had felt covering hers, warm and strong and solid. She told herself she was being foolish, that she barely knew this man, that she was simply grateful for his help and confusing gratitude with something deeper. But her heart was not listening to her head's reasonable arguments. When she finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with blue eyes and gentle smiles, and the feeling of safety she had not experienced since Thomas's death. They rose before sunrise the next morning, and Clara made a quick breakfast of eggs and bacon while Isaac readied the horses, and by the time the first light was painting the mountains pink, they were on the road to Alamosa again. This ride was different from their frantic race the day before, calmer and more purposeful, and they talked easily as they traveled, sharing stories about their lives and discovering unexpected common ground. Isaac told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was young, about how he had learned to be self-reliant because there was no one else to depend on, and Clara heard the loneliness in his voice that mirrored her own. She told him about her childhood in La Veta, about her parents who still lived in town and worried constantly about her managing the ranch alone, about how she had always dreamed of traveling beyond Colorado, but had never had the chance. Isaac listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he truly wanted to understand who she was, and Clara felt herself opening up to him in ways she had not opened up to anyone since Thomas. There was something about Isaac that made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to admit her fears and doubts without worrying about being judged. They reached Alamosa before noon and went directly to the home of Justice Garrett, the notary public who had witnessed Thomas's original loan document. The elderly man remembered the transaction clearly, because Thomas had been so particular about getting everything properly documented, and he was outraged when Isaac explained what the bank was trying to do. Justice Garrett immediately prepared a sworn affidavit confirming that he had notarized the loan document in Clara's possession, and that the amount listed was the true and only amount Thomas had borrowed, and he signed it with a flourish that suggested he was personally insulted by Whitmore's fraud. Armed with this new evidence, Clara and Isaac rode back to La Veta and went straight to Attorney Thornton's office, even though it meant another long ride. Thornton reviewed the affidavit with obvious satisfaction and told them this was exactly what they needed to get the injunction made permanent and possibly even have criminal charges filed against Whitmore. He suggested they present the evidence to Judge Morrison first thing the next morning when he would be holding court in La Veta, and he assured Clara that the judge was known for being fair and having little tolerance for banking fraud. That evening, back at Clara's ranch, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple, and Clara felt a peace settle over her that had been absent for 8 long months. Isaac sat beside her on the wooden bench Thomas had built, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and the air between them felt charged with unspoken feelings. Clara wanted to reach for his hand, wanted to tell him that he had become important to her in a way that went far beyond gratitude. But she held back, afraid of moving too fast, afraid of what it would mean to care for someone again when she knew how devastating loss could be. "Clara," Isaac said softly, using her first name for the first time, and she turned to look at him, her breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. "I know this might not be the right time, and I do not want to presume anything, but I need you to know that helping you these past 2 days has been the most meaningful thing I have done in a very long time. You are an incredible woman, strong and brave and good, and I find myself hoping that even after this legal business is settled, you might allow me to continue spending time with you." Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she processed his words, understanding that he was offering her something precious and fragile, the possibility of a new beginning. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would not want her to spend the rest of her life alone and grieving. Thomas had always wanted her to be happy, had told her so explicitly in those final pain-filled moments before the injuries from his fall had claimed him, and she believed with her whole heart that he would approve of Isaac, would see the goodness in him that she saw. "Isaac," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I would like that very much. These past 2 days you have shown me kindness and courage when I needed it most, and I feel more alive when I am with you than I have felt in a very long time. I do not know what the future holds, but I would very much like to explore it with you by my side." Isaac's face broke into a smile that transformed his serious features into something beautiful, and he reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together in a way that felt both natural and momentous. They sat like that as the stars began to appear overhead, talking quietly about hopes and dreams and the possibility of building something good together. And Clara felt her heart opening in ways she had thought impossible just days before. When Isaac finally stood to head inside for the night, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. The next morning they dressed carefully for court, Clara in her best dark dress and Isaac in clean clothes, borrowed from Thomas's wardrobe that fit him surprisingly well. And they rode into La Veta together, with Attorney Thornton's affidavit safely tucked in Clara's bag. The courthouse was already full when they arrived, because word had spread through the small town about the case, and Clara saw many familiar faces in the gallery, neighbors and friends who had come to support her. Her parents were there too, her mother reaching out to squeeze her hand as Clara passed, and she felt strength flow from that touch. Judge Morrison was a stern-looking man in his 60s with a reputation for running his courtroom with an iron fist, and he called the case to order with a bang of his gavel that made everyone snap to attention. Attorney Thornton presented Clara's case with eloquence and precision, laying out the evidence of fraud with damning clarity, and Clara watched Nathaniel Whitmore's face grow paler as the judge examined the original loan document and Justice Garrett's affidavit. Whitmore's own attorney, a slick-looking man from Denver, tried to argue that the bank's records were more reliable than personal documents, but Judge Morrison cut him off with a sharp question about why the bank's records did not match a notarized legal document. The hearing lasted nearly 2 hours, with both sides presenting arguments and evidence, and Clara sat beside Isaac in the front row, drawing courage from his solid presence. When it was her turn to testify, she stood and answered the judge's questions clearly and honestly, showing him every receipt for every payment she had made, explaining how she had been faithfully meeting her obligations when the bank suddenly claimed she was in default. Judge Morrison listened intently, and Clara thought she saw a flash of sympathy in his stern eyes. Finally, after reviewing all the evidence one more time, Judge Morrison delivered his ruling. He declared that the bank had engaged in fraudulent practices, that Clara's loan documents and payment receipts were clearly legitimate, and that the attempted seizure of her property had been illegal. He made the injunction permanent, ensuring that the Denver First National Bank could not take Clara's land, and he ordered the bank to pay her damages for the distress and expense they had caused. Furthermore, he announced that he was forwarding the case to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution of Nathaniel Whitmore for fraud and attempted theft. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face as the reality of her victory sank in. Isaac pulled her into his arms right there in front of everyone, holding her as she sobbed with relief, and Clara did not care what anyone thought about the impropriety of being embraced by a man who was not her husband. Her ranch was safe, her home was hers, and the man who had tried to steal it was going to face justice. Whitmore stormed out of the courtroom with his attorney hurrying behind him, and Clara caught a glimpse of his furious face and felt no sympathy whatsoever. After the hearing, Clara's parents insisted on taking her and Isaac to lunch at the town's best restaurant, and Clara endured their polite but pointed questions about who exactly Isaac was and what his intentions were toward their daughter. Isaac handled the interrogation with grace and honesty, explaining that he cared for Clara deeply and hoped to court her properly if she and her parents were agreeable. Clara's mother exchanged a significant look with her father, and Clara could see them softening toward Isaac despite their initial wariness, charmed by his respectful manner and obvious devotion to their daughter. Over the next several weeks, Isaac became a constant presence at Clara's ranch, helping her with repairs and livestock management while also continuing his work at the Double R Ranch to earn his keep. They fell into an easy rhythm of shared labor and shared meals, and Clara found herself falling more deeply in love with him every single day. She loved the way he sang old cowboy songs while mending fences, loved the gentle way he treated her animals, loved how he never tried to take over or treat her like she was helpless, but instead worked alongside her as an equal partner. Their first real kiss happened on a warm evening in August, a month after the court victory, when they were sitting by the creek that ran through Clara's property. They had been talking about their dreams for the future, about how Isaac might be able to buy the neighboring property that was up for sale and expand their combined ranching operation. When Isaac had suddenly cupped her face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her with a passion that stole her breath away. Clara had kissed him back with equal fervor, all the feelings she had been carefully controlling over the past weeks pouring out in that single perfect moment. After that, they were inseparable, and everyone in La Veta accepted that Isaac Harper and Clara Zimmerman were courting seriously and would likely be married before the year was out. True to the gossip's predictions, Isaac proposed to Clara on a crisp evening in late September, presenting her with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, and asking her to be his wife in a voice thick with emotion. Clara said yes without hesitation, because she knew with absolute certainty that Isaac was her future, that he was the man she wanted to build a life with, that loving him did not diminish what she had shared with Thomas, but rather honored it by showing she was strong enough to love again. They were married in early October in the small church where Clara had married Thomas 5 years earlier, but instead of feeling strange or disloyal, it felt right and good, like Clara was being given a second chance at happiness. Isaac stood at the altar in a new suit, his blue eyes bright with tears as Clara walked down the aisle in a simple cream-colored dress, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed her with such tenderness that half the congregation started crying. The reception was held at Clara's parents' house, with the entire town turning out to celebrate, and even attorney Thornton made the trip from Alamosa to wish them well. That night, Isaac carried Clara over the threshold of the ranch house that was now truly theirs together, and they made love for the first time with a combination of passion and gentleness that left Clara feeling cherished and whole. Isaac was an attentive lover, patient and caring, making sure Clara felt safe and desired, and afterward they lay tangled together in the darkness, talking about their hopes for the future and the children they wanted to have. Clara felt a completeness she had not experienced since before Thomas's death, a sense that her life was finally moving forward again, instead of being frozen in grief. The months that followed their wedding were busy and productive, with Isaac proving to be everything Clara had hoped for in a partner. He was an excellent rancher, with instincts about cattle and horses that complemented Clara's own knowledge, and together they managed to turn the struggling ranch into a profitable operation. Isaac also proved to be handy with repairs, fixing things around the property that had been neglected during Clara's time as a widow. And Clara loved watching him work, loved the way his muscles moved under his shirt, loved how he would catch her staring and give her a wink that made her blush. News reached them in late November that Nathaniel Whitmore had been convicted of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison, and that the Denver First National Bank had been fined heavily for their role in the scheme. Clara felt vindicated, but mostly just relieved that the entire ordeal was finally, completely over. The bank's new manager, a decent man named Mr. Patterson, had personally apologized to Clara, and assured her that her loan records had been corrected, and she would never have any trouble with payments again. Winter came to La Veta with heavy snows that blanketed the mountains and valley in white, and Clara and Isaac spent long evenings by the fire, reading or talking or simply enjoying each other's company. Clara had never been happier, and she told Isaac so frequently, wanting him to know how much he meant to her, how grateful she was that he had walked into her life at exactly the moment she needed him. Isaac always responded by pulling her close and telling her that he was the grateful one, that she had given him a home and a purpose when he had been drifting aimlessly, that loving her was the best thing he had ever done. Spring arrived with the usual explosion of wildflowers across the mountain meadows, and Clara discovered she was pregnant, a development that filled both her and Isaac with joy and anticipation. Isaac became even more protective and attentive, constantly fussing over Clara and making sure she did not overexert herself, and Clara had to remind him gently that she was pregnant, not fragile, and could still do most of her regular work. They spent hours discussing potential names and decorating the small room that would become the nursery, and Clara felt her heart overflow with love for this man, who was so excited about becoming a father. Their son was born in late November of 1883, a healthy baby boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and they named him Thomas Isaac Harper, honoring both the husband Clara had lost and the husband who had saved her. Isaac cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the weight of this tiny, perfect person who depended on him completely. And Clara watched her husband cradle their baby and knew that she had been blessed beyond measure. Her mother came to stay for a few weeks to help with the baby, and she confided to Clara that she could see how much Isaac loved her and little Thomas, and that she was glad Clara had found happiness again. The years that followed were full of hard work and deep satisfaction, with the ranch prospering and their family growing. A daughter arrived 2 years after Thomas, a beautiful girl with Isaac's smile and Clara's stubborn determination, and they named her Sarah Rose Harper. Then came another son 3 years later, whom they named Daniel James Harper, and finally a second daughter 2 years after that, Emma Grace Harper. The ranch house that had once felt too empty was now filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing, and Clara and Isaac worked side by side to raise their family and build their legacy. Isaac proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful with the children while also teaching them the value of hard work and responsibility. Clara loved watching him with their kids, loved seeing young Thomas shadow his father around the ranch, loved hearing Sarah's delighted giggles when Isaac tossed her in the air, loved the way Daniel and Emma fought for space on Isaac's lap during story time. Their children grew up knowing they were deeply loved, knowing their parents had overcome hardship to build this life, knowing the value of fighting for what was right. The story of how Isaac had helped Clara save her ranch became family legend, told and retold to the children as they grew older, and Clara always made sure to emphasize the importance of standing up against injustice and helping those in need. Young Thomas was particularly fascinated by the tale of his parents' desperate race to Alamosa and back, and he would beg his father to tell him every detail of that day, hanging on every word. Isaac would oblige, making the story exciting and dramatic while also teaching important lessons about courage and integrity. Clara's parents lived long enough to see all 4 of their grandchildren, and they often remarked on how proud they were of Clara for her strength and resilience, and how grateful they were that Isaac had come into her life. When her father passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1892, Clara grieved deeply but found comfort in Isaac's steady presence, and the knowledge that her father had died happy, surrounded by family and confident that his daughter was well cared for. Her mother followed 3 years later, and Clara planted roses on both their graves, visiting them regularly with the children to make sure they remembered their grandparents. As the children grew older and began helping more substantially with the ranch work, Clara and Isaac found themselves with a bit more time to simply enjoy each other's company, and their love only deepened with the passing years. Isaac would still sometimes grab Clara in the middle of the day and kiss her soundly, telling her she was as beautiful as the day he first saw her standing outside the bank looking like her world was ending. Clara would laugh and swat him playfully, but she treasured those moments of affection, treasured the way their marriage had remained passionate and romantic even as they dealt with the mundane challenges of running a ranch and raising 4 children. They expanded the ranch substantially over the years, buying additional acreage when it became available and building their herd into one of the finest in the region. Isaac's instincts about cattle breeding proved particularly valuable, and they developed a reputation for producing high-quality stock that sold for premium prices. The ranch that Clara had fought so hard to save became a prosperous enterprise that would provide security for generations to come. And every time Clara looked out over the land stretching toward the mountains, she felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this point. Thomas, their eldest son, grew into a fine young man with his late namesake's careful nature and his father's strength, and when he turned 21, Isaac deeded him a portion of the ranch to manage as his own. Thomas married a sweet girl from town named Elizabeth, and they built a house on their section of the property, keeping the family close while allowing the younger generation to establish their independence. Clara delighted in becoming a grandmother when Thomas and Elizabeth welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Clara in honor of the grandmother who had fought so hard to preserve the family legacy. Sarah grew up to be as stubborn and determined as her mother, and she shocked everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to become a teacher. Clara and Isaac supported her decision fully, helping her get the education she needed, and Sarah eventually opened a small school in La Veta that served ranch families throughout the valley. She married one of her fellow teachers, a gentle man named Robert who appreciated her fierce intelligence, and they had 3 children who Sarah raised to value education and independent thinking. Daniel inherited his father's love of working with horses, and he became an expert trainer, breaking and gentling horses for ranches throughout Colorado. He traveled extensively in his 20s, learning techniques from different regions, before finally settling back in La Veta with a wife he had met in Denver, a practical woman named Margaret who managed his business affairs while he worked with the animals. They had twin boys who kept them constantly busy and entertained, and Daniel built a house just down the road from the main ranch so his sons could grow up with their cousins. Emma, the youngest, was the most adventurous of the Harper children, and she spent her late teens and early 20s traveling through the West, writing articles about her experiences for various newspapers and magazines. Clara worried constantly about her youngest daughter wandering around unchaperoned, but Isaac counseled patience, pointing out that Emma had inherited her mother's strength and would be fine. Emma eventually returned to La Veta with a husband in tow, a journalist named William who had fallen head over heels for her during a shared stage coach journey, and they settled into a small house in town, where Emma continued her writing career while raising their daughter. As Clara and Isaac moved into their 50s and then 60s, they gradually turned over more of the daily ranch operations to their children and grandchildren, though neither of them ever fully retired. They remained active and involved, offering advice and assistance when needed but trusting the younger generation to make their own decisions, and sometimes their own mistakes. Clara loved having the time to spend with her grandchildren, teaching them to cook and garden and telling them stories about their family history, while Isaac took on the role of patriarch with natural authority and grace. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Clara with a trip to Denver, their first real vacation in years, and they stayed in a fancy hotel and attended theater performances and fine restaurants like a pair of young newlyweds. Clara wore a new dress that Isaac had secretly commissioned, and she felt beautiful and cherished as her husband escorted her around the city, proudly introducing her to everyone they met as his wife and the love of his life. They returned to Lavender refreshed and more in love than ever, and Clara thanked God for giving her a second chance at happiness with this remarkable man. The autumn of 1907 brought a particularly beautiful season to Lavender, with the aspens turning gold against the evergreens, and the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Clara and Isaac celebrated her 49th birthday with a huge party attended by all their children and grandchildren. And as Clara looked around at the faces of the family they had built together, she felt a sense of completeness that brought tears to her eyes. Isaac noticed her emotional state and pulled her aside, wrapping her in his strong arms and asking what was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," Clara assured him, reaching up to touch his face, now lined with age but still handsome to her eyes. "I was just thinking about how much my life has changed since that terrible day when the bank tried to take everything. I was so frightened and alone, and then you appeared like an answer to prayer, and you have given me more happiness than I ever could have imagined. I love you so much, Isaac Harper, and I thank God every day that you decided to help a desperate widow standing outside a bank." Isaac kissed her softly, his blue eyes bright with emotion. "Clara, you are the one who gave me everything. Before I met you, I was just drifting through life without purpose or direction. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to be better than I was. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life, and I would ride to Alamosa and back 1,000 times if it meant spending one more day with you." They stood together in the golden autumn light, surrounded by the sounds of their family celebrating, and Clara knew that she had been blessed beyond measure. The ranch that had nearly been stolen from her now supported not just her and Isaac, but their children and grandchildren as well, a living legacy of their love and determination. The land stretched out around them, beautiful and productive, the mountains standing eternal witness to the life they had built. As the years continued to pass, Clara and Isaac grew old together with grace and contentment, their love remaining strong even as their bodies slowed down. They spent their evenings on the porch they had sat on that first night when Isaac had asked to court her, watching sunsets and holding hands and reminiscing about their life together. Their children and grandchildren visited frequently, filling the house with noise and laughter, and both Clara and Isaac agreed that this was exactly the kind of old age they had dreamed of, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting. When Clara turned 60, Isaac gave her a beautiful locket containing tiny photographs of all 4 of their children, and Clara wore it every day, touching it whenever she needed to feel close to the people she loved most. Isaac teased her gently about becoming sentimental in her old age, and Clara reminded him that he was the one who cried at every family gathering, which made him laugh and concede the point. They had become that couple that everyone pointed to as an example of true love, their devotion to each other obvious in every glance and touch, and younger couples often ask them for advice on maintaining a strong marriage. Their advice was always simple but heartfelt. Choose kindness, communicate honestly, never go to bed angry, and remember that marriage is a partnership where both people need to pull their weight. Isaac would add that it was important to marry someone you genuinely liked as well as loved, someone whose company you enjoyed even during mundane moments, and Clara would nod in agreement and reach for his hand. They had certainly faced their share of challenges over the years, but they had always faced them together, and that unity had carried them through everything. The spring of 1915 brought the arrival of their first great-grandchild, Thomas and Elizabeth's oldest daughter's baby, and Clara held the tiny infant with wonder, marveling at how her family kept growing and expanding. Isaac joked that they were going to need to buy more land just to have room for all their descendants, and Clara laughed and said that would not be such a terrible problem to have. They threw a huge family reunion that summer, with relatives coming from all over Colorado and even a few from neighboring states, and the ranch was filled with people celebrating the Harper family legacy. At the reunion, young Clara, their granddaughter and the baby's mother, made a speech thanking her grandmother for being such a strong example of courage and determination. She told the assembled crowd the story of how Clara had fought to save the ranch and how Isaac had helped her, and how that act of bravery had created the foundation for everything that came after. Clara found herself crying as her granddaughter spoke, and Isaac squeezed her hand tight, his own eyes suspiciously bright. To know that their story had inspired the next generation, that their love had created this sprawling, beautiful family, was a gift beyond measure. As they moved into their 70s, both Clara and Isaac began to slow down more noticeably, their bodies finally demanding rest after lifetimes of hard physical work. They spent more time sitting and less time working, more time remembering and less time planning for the future, but they were content with this natural progression. Their children made sure they were comfortable and cared for, and the grandchildren visited constantly, eager to spend time with the patriarch and matriarch of the family while they still could. One evening in late summer of 1920, Clara and Isaac sat on their porch watching another spectacular Colorado sunset, and they talked about their favorite memories from their 38 years of marriage. Isaac reminded Clara about their frantic race to Alamosa, about how terrified he had been that they would not make it in time, about how he had known even then that she was someone special. Clara recalled their first kiss by the creek, the way her heart had pounded when Isaac proposed, the joy of holding their first baby, the satisfaction of watching their children grow into good people. "If I had to do it all over again, I would not change a single thing," Clara said softly, leaning her head against Isaac's shoulder. "Even the hard parts were worth it because they led me to you and to this life we have built together." Isaac kissed the top of her head, his arms wrapping around her in the familiar embrace she had come to rely on for nearly 4 decades. "I feel the same way, my love. Every moment with you has been a gift, even the difficult ones. You are my heart, Clara Harper, and you always will be." They sat together as the stars began to appear, comfortable in the silence that only comes from years of deep companionship, and Clara felt at peace. She had lived a good life, a full life, and she had been blessed with love twice over. Thomas would always hold a special place in her heart, but Isaac had shown her that the heart was capable of expanding to hold multiple loves without diminishing any of them. She had been a widow who had nearly lost everything, saved by a cowboy who had become her husband and the father of her children, and together they had built something that would endure long after they were gone. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of Thomas and his siblings, with each of the Harper children contributing their unique skills and talents to the family enterprise. New generations were born, children who would never know the fear of losing their home because their great-grandmother had fought to preserve it. Children who grew up hearing the legend of the banker who had tried to steal the land, and the cowboy who had helped reverse the deed before sundown. The story became part of the family's identity, a reminder that courage and love could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Clara and Isaac lived to see their grandchildren marry and have children of their own, lived to see the ranch expand far beyond what they had ever imagined possible, lived to celebrate their golden wedding anniversary surrounded by more than 100 descendants and friends. At that anniversary party, held at the ranch on a perfect October day in 1933, their children organized a surprise where every single person in attendance shared a favorite memory of Clara and Isaac, and the testimonials lasted for hours, filled with laughter and tears and profound appreciation for two people who had touched so many lives. When it was Isaac's turn to speak, he stood with some difficulty, his 78-year-old body stiff from decades of hard work, and he looked at Clara with such love that everyone in the room felt it. 50 years ago, I saw a woman standing outside a bank looking lost and scared, and something inside me said that I had to help her. I did not know then that I was not saving her, she was saving me. Clara, you have been my partner, my lover, my best friend, and my reason for being for half a century now, and if I could do it all again, I would still choose you every single time. You are my miracle, and I love you more than words can ever express. Clara stood and walked to her husband, taking his weathered hands in her own, and she looked into those blue eyes that still made her heart skip a beat even after 50 years. Isaac, you rode into my life when I needed a hero, and you have been my hero every day since then. You showed me that love does not end with death, that the heart can heal and grow and love again. You gave me a family and a future when I thought I had neither, and I have spent 50 years being grateful that you stopped to help a widow in distress. I love you beyond measure, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. They kissed while their family and friends applauded and cheered, and Clara felt the same flutter in her stomach that she had felt the first time Isaac kissed her all those years ago. Love, true love, did not fade with time. It only deepened and became more precious, and Clara knew she had been blessed to experience it twice in one lifetime. Isaac passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later in the winter of 1935, and Clara sat beside his bed holding his hand as he took his last breath, grateful that he had not suffered but heartbroken to lose him. Their children gathered around her, supporting her through the grief, and Clara took comfort in knowing that Isaac had lived a long, happy life surrounded by people who loved him. They buried him in the small cemetery at the edge of town, not far from where Thomas lay, and Clara visited his grave every week, talking to him about the family and the ranch, and how much she missed his presence. Clara lived for another 7 years after Isaac's death, years filled with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and though she missed Isaac terribly, she never regretted the life they had built together. She spent her final years telling stories to the youngest generation, making sure they understood where they came from and what their great-grandparents had sacrificed to give them this legacy. She talked about Isaac constantly, keeping his memory alive, and she often said that she was just waiting until it was her turn to join him again. When Clara died peacefully at age 84 in the spring of 1942, surrounded by her 4 children and numerous grandchildren, her last words were Isaac's name, spoken with love and anticipation. They buried her beside her beloved husband, and the entire town of La Veta turned out for the funeral, paying respects to a woman who had become a legend in her own right. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations, and every Harper child grew up knowing the story of how their great-great-grandmother had nearly lost everything, and how a cowboy named Isaac had helped her save it, and in the process, had found his own salvation. The land that Clara had fought so hard to preserve continued to thrive, generation after generation, a living testament to love and courage, and the power of two people choosing to stand together against injustice. The mountains watched over the Harper Ranch just as they had watched over Clara and Isaac, eternal and unchanging, and visitors to the property often remarked that there was something special about the place, a sense of love and history that seemed to permeate the very soil. The family made sure that Clara and Isaac's graves were always well tended, with fresh flowers placed there regularly. And every year on their anniversary, the entire extended Harper family would gather at the ranch to celebrate the love story that had started it all. In the end, Clara and Isaac's story became exactly what they would have wanted it to be, a tale of hope and second chances, and the idea that even in our darkest moments, love can find us and transform everything. The banker who had tried to seize the widow's land at noon had failed, defeated by a cowboy who had the deed reversed by sundown, but more than that, defeated by two people who refused to give up, who fought for what was right, and who built a love that lasted beyond their own lifetimes. Their descendants carried their legacy forward, generation after generation, always remembering that they came from people who had looked injustice in the face and won, who had chosen love when it would have been easier to remain alone, who had built something beautiful and lasting that continued to shelter and sustain their family more than a century later. The ranch house still stood on the land Clara had fought to save, expanded and modernized over the years, but still containing the bones of the original structure that Thomas's father had built and that Clara had scrubbed clean in her darkest days. The desk where Clara had kept her payment receipts was preserved as a family heirloom, and the metal box that had held them was displayed in a place of honor, a reminder of the evidence that had saved everything. The mountains still rose in the west, painting the same spectacular sunsets that Clara and Isaac had watched from their porch, and the creek still ran through the property where they had shared their first kiss. And on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the valley, some said you could almost feel the presence of Clara and Isaac, still watching over the land they loved, still walking together through the home they had built, still holding hands and sharing the kind of love that transcends death itself. The banker had tried to take it all, but the cowboy had saved it, and in doing so, he had saved himself and created a legacy that would endure for generations, a testament to the truth that love, courage, and justice will always triumph in the end.